On Friday, July 26, 2024, the Ashley Benefield trial continued with day 4 of testimony. And on this day, 5 witnesses were called up to the stand. 2 of them, however, testified outside the presence of the jury. But most important to talk about on day 4 was that Ashley Benefield, the defendant in this trial, testified early in the day. Reactions seemed to be split on how she came across on the witness stand. For my part, day 4 has me thinking fairly strongly that she is in fact a victim of DV and that she was in reasonable fear of her life when she shot Doug. In this recap, I'm going to tell you why this testimony today convinced me of that, at least up to this point. Let's get into it. So for starters, I personally am very appreciative of the fact that Ashley testified on a Friday because it has taken me a while to go through and digest both her direct examination and her cross-examination. Her testimony is obviously very important to this entire case, and in fact, it can make or break it for either side. And I always want to make sure that when we approach difficult topics like this, we do so carefully and with respect to all sides here. Because on the one hand, you do have one man who has died and left behind a now 23-year-old daughter, as well as a 6-year-old daughter. And then on the other hand, you have a woman who, if convicted, will in a sense also be leaving behind that 6-year-old daughter. You have either a murder victim or a DV victim, or maybe even both with some kind of a mix in between. This is all very emotionally charged and complicated stuff. And so with all of this complication, this actually took me the better part of the weekend to go through this testimony and to sit with it and digest it. So I really appreciate your patience while I work to get this admittedly long video out. And I will also say, although I do try to make these recaps as comprehensive as I can while also condensing them as much as possible, I do highly recommend that if you haven't done so already, that you go ahead and watch the Ashley Benefield direct and cross-examination yourself to make your own determinations there. Anyway, let's get on to what actually happened on day 4. Okay, so the first witness of the day was the defense's first witness, Faith Brown. She was Ashley's family law attorney involved in the same matters as Stephanie Murphy. Now, as you can imagine, basically the whole purpose of her testimony was to rebut the testimony of Stephanie Murphy. And this was essentially about the hearings that were coming up around the time of the shooting, as well as the purpose of those hearings. Now, if you remember, the state was pretty adamant that Ashley's motive for killing Doug was that she didn't want Dr. Broder's report to be released at the September 30th, 2020 hearing. And Stephanie Murphy was likewise pretty adamant about her belief on that when she testified. However, when Faith Brown testified, she read all of the back and forth emails between herself, Stephanie Murphy, and the judicial assistant who's organizing Judge Moreland's calendar to the jury. And in these emails, there was discussion about not just scheduling these dates for these hearings, but what these hearings were going to be about and what was required in order to hear these things at the hearings. And credit to the defense. They do in fact appear to show that everyone had an understanding that the September 30th hearing was in fact not to release Dr. Broder's report, but rather to hear Ashley's petition for an injunction. Now, one thing that Stephanie Murphy had mentioned in her back and forth with the defense on cross-examination the other day was that she said that the nature of what had to be discussed at the hearing was also changed at the mediation that they had. And if I'm not mistaken, this mediation would have taken place after these emails. And that mediation conversation may or may not have been reflected by some sort of a follow-up email. So honestly, at the end of the day, I don't know if the jury is going to really be able to follow all of this back and forth between these emails and what Stephanie Murphy said and what Faith Brown said, because it's a little complicated and kind of administrative in nature. All to get to one question. Was the September 30th hearing really going to be about Dr. Broder's report or something else? It's a potentially important question, but in comparison to so many other questions in this case, I don't know that the jury is necessarily going to want to focus on it, or maybe will want to, but maybe can't focus on it. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Okay, so then we got to the main focal point of the day, and that was Ashley Benefield's testimony. As you can imagine, this took up quite a bit of the day, and this is going to take the bulk of this recap. To start out, defense attorney Neil Taylor began her direct examination by going over just a little bit of her background. She grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas. Her dad was a Navy pilot. That kind of stuff. But then Taylor had Ashley recount the most difficult part of her testimony almost immediately, which was the September 27th shooting. I will say, I found this to be a bit of a surprising strategy, to be honest. It didn't give Ashley much of an opportunity to get in any way comfortable on the witness stand before being faced with what she says is basically the scariest day of her life. And now maybe that doesn't really matter because she was going to be uncomfortable up there no matter what. But if I were the attorney, I think I would want to try a different strategy just so the jury can become familiar with Ashley's baseline as she's talking about the things that are a little bit easier to talk about before getting into this part. And getting her a little bit more comfortable could help her connect with the jury a little bit, or at least have them connect with what she's saying. But then again, as I always like to say, there are so many different ways to run a trial, and that includes strategy for things like this. And as I always want to be keeping in mind, my preferred way may not even necessarily be the best way. Anyway, so let's talk about her recounting of what happened on September 27th, 2020. She said that Doug had come over to help them move boxes into the U-Haul truck. And initially she said that the plan was to have Ashley's stuff put in last so it could be dropped off at her place when they got to Maryland. However, at one point she said that she noticed that everything was just getting mixed up together, and so when she pointed this out, Doug started to get upset. She said that he told her that she needed to start acting more like a wife. And so she said that she tried to change the subject, but he just got more aggressive and more threatening. Then she said that he started to body check her in the hallways, essentially shoving her with boxes, causing scratches on her body. All the while, by the way, Ashley's mom had taken Emerson to the park to stay out of the way of the moving process. Anyway, through this escalation of this conversation, she said that she tried to suggest that maybe they should be done for the day in the hopes that Doug would leave and then basically calm down. But here's what she says happened after she was struck by the cardboard box all the way through shooting Doug.
What was your response, Ashley, after being struck by the cardboard box?
I apologized.
Why would you have apologized?
Because I could see how upset he was, and I didn't want him to get more mad at me.
Where does Doug go after that incident?
He continued to the garage with the box.
And what happens at that point?
We started getting into a back and forth about being done for the day and what still needed to be packed and that I wanted to be done, and we ended up in our daughter's bedroom, and he started screaming at me. He said, "Shut the fuck up." He started calling me names. And he said, "I can see what you're doing. You're trying to get me to leave." He said, "I don't have to leave. I can stay and spend the night if I want to because I'm your husband."
At that point, Ashley, how did you feel with respect to your own personal safety?
I was scared.
Did you take any steps to try to avoid anything further?
Yes, I ran to try to leave the house.
And where did you run to?
To the front door.
Did you make it?
No.
Tell us what happened.
He stopped me. He grabbed me by the hand and he yanked me back. I'm not really sure how he did it, but he spun around so he was in front of me, between me and the door.
So
he said,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
He said, "Where the fuck do you think you're going?"
What was your response? Do you specifically recall? Tell us.
I just blurted it out. I said, "I'm done, and you need to leave now."
What was Doug's reaction to that command to leave now?
He said, "You can't fucking leave me."
Then what happens?
He hit me on the side of the head.
Ashley, I'm going to ask you what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit number 7. Tell us what that represents.
It's a picture of my face.
Is it an accurate picture of what your face looked like on that night?
Yes, sir.
Who took that photograph?
I don't remember her name. She was at the sheriff's office.
At the sheriff's office? Okay. Now, what is it about that photograph that shows or reflects the slap or the hit that you got to the side of your head on that day by Doug?
That side of my face is like swollen and puffy and discolored around my eye.
And is your eyelid drooping
Yes.
on the side where you were hit?
Yes.
Your Honor, I move defense exhibit number 7 into evidence.
Received.
What was different at that moment, Ashley, than at any time in your prior relationship with Doug?
He had never actually hit me before.
What did you do?
I ran
Where?
to my room
Why?
because I was scared.
Ashley, did you have anything in your room that could protect you?
I had my gun.
Did you grab the gun?
Yes.
As you're grabbing the gun, what, if anything, did you hear?
I heard the door hitting the doorstop.
As if it is flung open?
Yes.
And what do you see, Ashley, when you look up?
Doug was standing in the doorway. His face was red. Like the veins were bulging in his neck. The way he was looking at me, it didn't even look like Doug. His eyes were black.
Does he yell anything at you?
He said, "You're fucking done."
And what does he do at that point?
I held the gun like in front of me and I said, "Stop." And he like turned and he got into this like a fighting stance. I got low and he started like moving his arms and his hands around. And he was making these like jerking motions.
What were you expecting when you were holding the gun out in front of you and you told him to stop?
I thought when he saw it he would leave.
Did he?
No.
At that point, Ashley, what are you thinking?
I thought he was gonna kill me.
Tell us what happens next.
He started coming towards me, and then he lunged at me, and I started pulling the trigger. And he just kept coming, and I remember trying to move to get away from him, but he kept coming at me.
Ashley, would you tell us why, if you're holding a loaded firearm, you were attempting to move away?
I was trying to get away from him. I was terrified.
All right, so you're firing. He keeps advancing. What happens next?
It was like his feet slipped out from under him and his legs went up in the air.
When Doug hits the floor, what's your immediate reaction?
I ran to get help.
Can you tell us how many shots you fired?
I have no idea. I was in a panic.
Do you remember anything about the shooting beyond what you've told us here?
It was a blur.
Where did you run for help, Ashley?
To my neighbor's house.
What's your neighbor's name?
John Sant.
Ashley, I have to ask you a couple of very difficult questions. You okay?
Yeah, sorry.
tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury why you shot Doug.
I was scared to death. I thought he was gonna kill me. But there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in my own house. He wouldn't let me leave.
As you sit here today, Ashley, how do you feel about what happened?
Horrible. He's the father of my child. And someday you have to explain it all to her.
Judge, I wonder, could we have a minute, maybe a brief recess, to have her compose herself?
All right. This is the jury. If you could step out for a couple of minutes, we'll bring you right back. Just leave your notes where they are. You put them face down. Please don't begin your deliberations. You can use your phones, but don't talk with anybody outside the jury about the case. Don't do any research on the people, places, things, or legal topics we're going to talk anything about. Thank you. All right, you all can have a seat. Ms. Benefield, you can have a seat. You need to take a moment to compose yourself.
Yeah, would it be all right if she stepped out?
No, sir.
May I approach her? With no conversation?
As long as you don't say anything. Yeah.
Not say a word.
Yes.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Ma'am, there's Kleenexes here next to you. Those.
Okay, thank you.
Now, that was admittedly a long clip, but I wanted to include her behavior after the jury walked out of the room. And this is because there's been a lot of discussion about whether she's acting or whether there is a sincere display of emotion on the stand happening. And, as always, everyone is entitled to their own opinions. And this includes, obviously, opinions on whether or not Ashley is being genuine here. The jury, after all, is going to be evaluating that along with everything else that they see on the stand. And I'll just say that for my part, my own personal opinion, I do believe her. I do, in fact, think that she's a DV survivor, and I think that in the moment of the shooting, she did, in fact, have a genuine fear for her life. And I think that that stems in large part from the history of DV between her and Doug. Now, I saw a lot of people in the court TV chat and the long crime chat basically deriding her for having fake tears or for not showing tears. But first of all, I don't know that we can even say that we can see clearly enough from the quality of this footage to show whether or not she's actually crying. But second, regardless, her emotional display, the way it gets triggered, the way it builds, and the way that it lingers long after the jury has left the room so that she can regain her composure, all of that feels like she is in the moment right now, reliving that trauma. And there's nothing here that to me feels forced. This does not remind me of Amber Heard, who would flip a switch and suddenly put on an act of trauma and upset, and then again turn that all off as soon as her attention was focused elsewhere and maybe the jury had just left the room. If Ashley were truly acting here, then I would say she's better than like 90% of actors in Hollywood, which is incredibly unlikely. And the fact that she has a lot of training in ballet does not equate to acting training or acting skills, especially not in this kind of a way. But anyway, then on direct examination, they basically go back over Ashley's and Doug's history to include when they met and when other bad encounters happened. This included something that happened apparently early on just after they had gotten married. Ashley said that she had plans to go on a cruise with her friends and with her mom. She said that she paid for herself and her mom, although we learned on cross-examination that Doug had paid for one of her friends to go. And so while she was on the cruise, she and Doug were still able to communicate largely by text. This all was apparently like about a month after they had gotten married. Now, on direct, the defense introduced a series of text messages sent by Doug that were fairly alarming. They referenced like exterminating rats and talking about being a warrior for the kingdom and that kind of thing. But they were actually introduced fairly without context. Here's a snippet of these texts so you can tell what I mean.
Like always being armed. And understanding them and how to conduct warfare in them for the kingdom. If I dwelt on it, I would go into a rage to remove them from the earth. I desire to exterminate them, and holding back is a challenge. They are rats that should be removed. Last night, just the jerks arguing near you about put me in sheer murderous mood, but I was stuck. I couldn't defend you. But could have been a fight, etc. Only you being with me will over time remove the images in my head. It is same, and knowing you were taken advantage of still in my mind makes me explode with anger to take them out. God made you for me. You haven't seen the war side and never want to. We went from joy and passion to now I'm in a testosterone rage inside. But kill the bad people.
So here it did sound like there was some kind of like a prior conversation that they had had where she told him about her own relationship history. And maybe she had had some sort of like a terrible experience where someone had attacked her or something, and that this was triggering him to have some sort of a protective response, knowing that she had been harmed by someone and that he wasn't there to protect her at that time because he didn't know her yet. And so one could conclude from those out of context texts that maybe she's, telling him this stuff basically to rile him up and to manipulate him. But on cross-examination, the prosecution tried to dig into this to give context to these text messages and to say, hey, he was just feeling protective over you because of your history, right? But what came out in this context is that these alarming texts that Doug sent her about being in a testosterone rage and essentially wanting to harm some other men, it doesn't come from anything that ever happened to her at all. Rather, here's the context. She said she was on the cruise and trying to find a decent spot to talk to him on the phone. She said that she was near the bar area and there were two guys talking or arguing nearby, and Doug could hear them in the background. And that's what caused him to fly into a rage. So I would see this part of the cross-examination as a complete failure by the state, because if anything, it makes Ashley look far more reasonable in saying she was over time afraid of him and that Doug was a violent guy who could fly into the rage at the drop of a hat and sometimes over something that is absolutely tiny. And this actually, I think, ended up becoming something of a theme for Ashley's testimony overall. On direct examination, I found myself leaning somewhat towards believing Ashley's testimony, but still somewhat on the fence. But on cross-examination, I felt like I was pushed all the way to taking her side even more because of the questions that were being asked and the answers that she was able to give them. To me, this overall cross-examination strategy that was taken up by the state was the wrong one, and for a number of reasons. This exchange about these kingdom warrior texts is just one example of this. But I'll explain more in a minute as to why I personally think that she's a real victim of DV. But first, I want to go into more of her testimony on the stand. Next, she talked about how over time, his sweet and loving and attentive demeanor changed into a controlling one. 3 months into the relationship, she said that he started getting possessive of her and trying to control all kinds of things, things like how she did her hair or makeup or how she dressed. Then she talked about an occasion when they went out to dinner with a friend who was visiting at the time. At dinner, she said that Doug had had a lot to drink, so when they were going home, she suggested that maybe she should drive home because he had had too much. This, she said, angered him quite a bit. She said that he started yelling at her on the way home, and this continued when they got home, and he tried to even flip a table. Now, in cross-examination, it came out that this was not long before they had had their reception for their marriage with friends and family. And so the prosecution introduced a few photos from the reception asking things like, well, were you living the nightmare here?
Are you scared here of Doug?
No, I would not say no.
You said on direct examination that around this time you were living the nightmare. Those were your words, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Were you living the nightmare here?
Oh, no, not at that moment, no. That was a very nice day.
How about at this moment?
Oh, it was a good day.
And States 102 at this moment?
Same. It was a good day.
And now I get why the prosecution was doing this. It's to call into question that Ashley was a DV victim at all, that she was living in perpetual fear of Doug, all of that. The prosecution here seems to have the stance that Ashley is lying about being an abuse victim at all. There's not a single part of Ashley's story that the state seems to be accepting might be true. But one problem here is that anyone who's familiar with DV, even on an intellectual level, understands that DV has cycles of abuse. The abuser does something to harm the victim, they apologize, they act sweetly to bring the victim back, and the victim does come back, things are great for a while, and then it all happens again. So the fact that there are nice days where the abuser is being a great person doesn't mean that the abuse isn't happening. And this line of questioning, to me, implies the prosecution lacks this amount of nuance to understand DV. Basically, it's a bit too blunt of a weapon that she's trying to wield here on this cross-examination for this particular case. It doesn't quite work in this situation, in my opinion. Anyway, then there are two incidents that came up on direct that for me start to get to the heart of why I think Ashley is a genuine DV survivor. The first is Ashley's recounting of Doug being cruel to their pets, their dog Sully and their cat Snuffy.
Any incidences in particular, Ashley, that stand out to you?
Yes.
Tell us, please.
We were having an argument, and he came at me like he was going to hit me. And our dog, Sully, jumped up in between us. And he punched him in the face so hard that he knocked him out. I just remember screaming because I thought he had killed him.
Were there other times that Doug hurt the animals?
Yes, he had kicked, punched Sully. He threw our cat multiple times. One time he threw Snuffy down the stairs.
And now I know that some people have brought up the stand your ground hearing that happened in this case where they went over a lot of these things previously in court. We actually streamed that hearing on this channel as well, although I admit that I don't remember basically anything that came out of that hearing, and I have not yet had time to revisit it. But people have said that what came out of that hearing is that Sully didn't just get between Ashley and Doug. That's not the way that all happened. What apparently came out was that Doug was wearing shorts while sitting on the couch and that Sully jumped onto his lap and that caused him pain, particularly from the dog's nails. And so in response, Doug apparently shoved Sully off of him. Now, while yes, that is different, there are some inconsistencies then if that is the case. There are still two issues with this. Number one, regardless of whether it's in context of a fight between the two or it's from Doug just sitting on the couch, the amount of force that is required to cause a dog to go unconscious is a very, very large amount. On the other hand, it does not take a lot of force to push a dog off you on the couch, even a fairly large dog. And I say this as someone with a dog that's around 50 to 60 pounds and has claws that often go unclipped because she won't let me trim them and can give a good tug on a leash when she gets excited because she's kind of a strong dog as well. So the amount of force that is required to push the dog off of you versus what's required to knock that dog unconscious. To me, that is still enough of a showing of force against a household pet that, in my opinion, amounts to animal cruelty. And on another point, the defense introduced into evidence text messages where they say that Doug admits to knocking Sully out. Now, they weren't published in the courtroom, or at least the cameras didn't show them if they were. So when the state unsuccessfully objected during her direct examination that the texts were somehow ambiguous, I don't know what's maybe ambiguous or straightforward about them. But the jury will be able to see the text themselves when they go in to deliberate, so they'll be able to make that determination if they think that it's an important point to focus on. And even still, other than that overruled objection on the admission of those texts, the state did not really contest any of these animal cruelty claims on cross-examination. And in an adversarial process, when one side leaves something uncontested, they leave behind an implication that it is probably true. Anyway, then there is the big incident that tells me most of all that Ashley was a victim of DV. And that was the June 2017 incident, which she talked about next in her testimony.
Was there an incident, Ashley, in June of 2017 that you vividly recall?
Yes.
Please explain it.
We were having an argument, and it started getting really out of hand. He pulled a gun out, and he was like waving it around, and then he threw it at me, and it hit the wall behind me, punched a hole in the wall. So I went to run to try to leave. He pulled the gun out and held it to his head. He said that he's gonna blow his fucking brains out, and I was gonna have to watch him. And he pulled the trigger and he shot a hole in the ceiling in the kitchen.
Ashley, at that point, what were you thinking about your marriage?
He wasn't anything like I thought he was. I feel like I had made a really big mistake marrying him. It was like I was just living in this nightmare. I never knew what I was going to get.
This is the part that I think is the most troublesome for the state, and particularly how the state has decided to play the strategy of this case. I said early on in these recaps that if there was any truth to these allegations, that this was going to be a big, big problem for the prosecution. And as for the strategy here, you can see that Suzanne O'Donnell on cross-examination started out with a really hard line with questions like, but did he ever punch you, or did he ever choke you? And to each of those questions, Ashley responded no.
I would like to just start with a couple of issues. So first, Doug Benefield never punched you ever, correct?
Yeah, I'd say that's correct.
Doug Benefield never choked you ever.
No.
He never kicked you.
No.
He never pointed a gun at you.
He waved a gun in my direction.
But it was not pointed at you, correct?
It was pointed at me while he was waving it at me.
He never came at you with a knife.
No.
Or a club.
No.
Or a baseball bat.
No.
And this fits into the overall theme by the state here, which is Ashley is not a DV victim, she's a manipulator. But this is a problem for the prosecution because DV isn't just the kind of violence that leaves a mark on a person. I've seen DV survivors talk about how when they were in an abusive relationship, they would actually wish that their abuser would hit them because they knew that they could take that to the police and actually be believed. And they would say that that would be precisely the reason that their abuser wouldn't hit them, because the abuser knew that if there was no physical marks on the victim, it would be much, much harder to convince the authorities that the abuse was happening. But the reality is, abuse isn't just physical. Sometimes the mental or emotional abuse is so much worse than the physical abuse. Things like physically harming the more vulnerable parties around the victim, like pets and small children, those are also forms of psychological abuse as well. And using threats or shows of force, that counts too. Throwing a loaded gun anywhere is reckless behavior with a firearm. Throwing it at a person should be an obvious sign of abuse, but I would say that even throwing it at a wall nearby is just as bad, because when that firearm hits that wall, it can fire a live round and you have no idea where it's going to go at that point. That is reckless, dangerous, volatile, and scary behavior on any measure. And shooting a loaded gun at the ceiling is similarly reckless behavior. And there was also testimony that Doug punched a wall as well. And here's the thing about these points about the gun incidents and the wall punching. All of these points have been corroborated in at least one other independent way. For example, on day 1, Eva testified to seeing the hole punched in the wall as well as the gunshot to the ceiling. She may not have been there when it actually happened, but she admitted to seeing evidence of both having happened. And what's more, there are text messages and deposition testimony from Doug admitting to doing these things. Like the dog admission text, we haven't seen these visually through the court feed, but there is testimony of these admissions through these texts. And the prosecution did not argue on any of these admissions. In other words, if I'm the prosecution and I'm thinking that these texts are things that don't say what the defense is saying they do, I'm going to want to dig in and make that clear to the jury. This is just too important of a point to let slip if there is a way to combat it. So the fact that they didn't do that on Ashley's cross-examination or any other point in the trial so far, for that matter, tells me personally that what Ashley is saying about these incidents is true. And so this brings me back to probably the biggest reason why I think that the state took a bad strategy with this cross-examination, maybe even with this entire case when I think about it. Remember, the state is saying that the abuse just didn't happen. They're saying that Ashley is a liar and a manipulator. And the truth is, strategy-wise, they could get there in a certain way on the parts of her testimony where she doesn't have corroboration. But the problem is, the state is treating all of it in the same way. The tone on cross-examination is sarcastic and mocking, regardless of whether O'Donnell is asking about the gun incidents or the package that Ashley said that she had a bad reaction to it with a headache because it gave her a headache from this sort of like chemical smell.
You say he was waving a gun around and threw a gun at you. Is that what you said?
Yes, ma'am.
So he has a gun in his hand, could point it at you,
He did point
but
it
he
at me.
throws a gun at the wall.
No, he threw it at me. He missed me.
Okay. And it hit the wall.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. When was this? What was the date of this argument?
I believe it was the end of June.
2017.
Yes, ma'am.
When was your...
And the big problem with this is, while they are rejecting her recounting of the incidents that have been corroborated, they're not giving the jury some reason grounded in evidence to similarly reject Ashley's recounting. Basically, it seems like they're not even really trying to disprove that he did these wild things in the past to scare her. Rather, it seems like they're more questioning why she would be scared of these things. So if the jurors are like me and they've been on the fence before Ashley's testimony, the jury may be thinking, okay, so are we just supposed to ignore the fact that it seems pretty well settled that he threw a loaded gun at the wall right next to her? Like, are we supposed to just pretend that that's not abusive behavior and that that is totally okay? Because that's kind of the implication from the kind of questions being asked by the state on cross-examination, as well as the tone of those questions. This, in my opinion, reduces the overall credibility of the state's argument because they look like they're being willfully blind here to the serious threats that he posed to Ashley at the beginning of their marriage. And it also makes it seem like the state is saying that there's no such thing as domestic abuse unless that abuse is physical and actually leaves a mark. That is simply not an accurate depiction of what DV actually is, and it's incredibly irresponsible, in my opinion, to make that suggestion in open court. And that's not the only reason why I think this cross-examination was overall, in my opinion, a failure. I already touched on this a bit with the part about the text exchange between Doug and Ashley around the cruise. But there were a bunch of things that, if left alone, were things in Ashley's narrative that didn't actually fully make sense to me and in the end were just kind of weird. But on cross-examination, O'Donnell really tried to go hard into some of these subjects. And in the end, all she ended up doing was actually giving Ashley a greater opportunity to give context to these things that now looked like, oh, okay, that's why she did that. Now I understand. For example, you might remember that on day 1, Eva said that Ashley would get really dramatic and overreact to small stuff and have these temper tantrum-like episodes as a result. She didn't give any specifics, but Ashley's cross-examination may have revealed one of them. On direct examination, the June 2017 gun incident was presented as an unknown argument that triggered all of this. On cross-examination, however, the state chose to give greater context for it to try to show Ashley as an overdramatic, dramatic, hysterical woman, basically over nothing. So here's the backstory to what apparently started the argument, which came out on cross.
And right around this time is when you say the incident happened where Doug threw a gun at a wall.
He threw it at me.
Shot a gun at the ceiling. I think you made several allegations, correct?
Yeah, he admitted to it, but yes.
What were you arguing about?
I think Eva was part of it. I don't specifically remember.
And wasn't it true that you had a problem with Eva and you thought she was disrespecting you at that time?
I wouldn't say I had a problem with Eva. There was a lot of tension in the house, but yeah, there's a lot of things going on that
Okay.
were not ideal.
You knew she was 15
Yeah.
and you knew she had just lost her mother tragically to death.
Yeah.
And you were how much older than her?
10 years, 9 years, 10 years.
And this tension surprised you.
No. I mean, at first he had told me that she was really going to love me and that she was ready to have a woman in her life and that he wanted me to move in quickly because she needed a mom. So he made it sound like she also felt that way.
And you had no feelings of your own.
I was excited to get to be her stepmom.
And you gave her a shadow box right around this time, correct?
For Christmas, so it would have been in December.
All right. And what was the shadow box?
You want me to describe it?
Yes.
It was like a small picture that had like deep sides and like the glass was at the front of it. And there was a sand dollar that I had painted and decorated. And I put it on like a black cardstock. And I wrote a saying on it that said something about how like you can be strong through the storms and that, you know, seashells are beautiful things that come out of storms.
And that shadow box is the reason you were arguing that day with Doug, correct?
I know it came up at one point. I don't know if that was the reason.
And what was the problem with the shadow box?
Eva had taken it apart and I guess had thrown out the thing that I made and was using the picture frame for something else.
What was she using the picture frame for?
She had put a rose from her mom's funeral in it.
And that upset you pretty badly, didn't it?
Made me really sad. I had taken a lot of time to make it for her and I thought it was special and yeah.
You began crying.
Yes.
And you dropped to the floor and sobbed hysterically.
Probably.
You were so upset that she put her dead mother's rose in the shadow box.
It wasn't that. It was that she took it apart. I mean, I would have bought her another shadow box.
You went to Doug and said it was disrespectful that she took this apart.
According to Doug?
No, according to you. You went to Doug and said, she's acting disrespectfully. You need to handle her. She upset me. I'm crying.
I don't remember saying that about that.
Isn't it, in fact, what you were arguing about before this whole incident with the gun and the ceiling?
Is this relevant as it relates to the daughter?
Can you approach, please?
So basically then they go on and it turns out that this turns into an argument between Ashley and Doug. And he says something like, I can't handle all of this kind of stuff that's happening at home and everywhere else. And then things escalate from there into what we know of as the June 2017 incident. Now, here's the thing. Not everyone sees this as something that is worthy of Ashley getting upset over. And there are some people who are relatively incredulous over her being upset specifically about the funeral rose. But at the moment that that came out on cross, that the gift that she had made for Eva was directly replaced by the funeral rose from Eva's mom's funeral, my instant reaction was, oh, that is so painful. Like I can instantly see why that would be like a knife right to Ashley's gut. Let me explain it. Already you have a very sensitive situation where you have a younger stepmother coming in to live with her older husband and his teenage daughter. That is a sensitive zone to be stepping into. Then you also have the layer of emotions on top of that, where it's not just that mom and dad are separated. Mom died. And then there's the fact that this grief is still very, very, very fresh. Mom died 9 months before dad remarried, and he remarried a woman closer in age to his daughter than to himself. Then on top of that, you have another emotional layer that is the fact that this was a super fast courtship. They essentially didn't know each other when they got married, and Ashley hadn't even met Eva until after she had married Eva's dad. There are just so many emotional tripwires that could individually explode. You put all of them together here, and you have a very easy situation for someone to get emotionally hurt just by the fact that someone else is coping with their rapidly changing and emotionally charged situation. So to make it clear, I also think that this was an impossible situation that Doug put his daughter Eva into. He communicated to Ashley that Eva was ready for a new mom, but clearly that's not the case. Eva even testified to that herself on day one. And this is someone who was in a stage of life where Eva was 15 years old. 15-year-old girls can be awesome and they can be so much fun, but they can also be absolutely brutal. I say this as a former teenage girl myself, who at a certain point went to school and socialized with other teenage girls, and as someone who as an adult spent a ton of time volunteering in youth organizations where teenage girls were prevalent. And that's just the baseline of like teenage girls. You take one that's grieving on top of that, and she absolutely has the capability of tearing your heart out, maybe even without meaning to do so. So then looking at this whole shadow box situation from the perspective of Ashley, she's an adult, yes, of course, but she is like 24 at the time. She's obviously much more mature than a 15-year-old, but to be able to navigate an emotionally fraught environment like what was going on at the Benefield house at this time, you really need to have some strong mental health and some deep wisdom for how to handle it. And if I look back at myself at 24 years old, I don't know that I would have been able to with my mindset at the time. And so I can see that Ashley probably looked at this gift as something that she wanted to communicate to her new stepdaughter, that she wanted to build a meaningful relationship with. And to do that, she gave her this gift that she had put a lot of time and thought and intention into. And when a gift like that is just discarded, it can be painful because it feels like a rejection of your relationship that you are trying to build with that person. And on top of that, not only was it discarded, it was replaced by a very deep, somber reminder of Eva's mother, who stood in that same role that you are kind of sort of trying to fill. Now, on the one hand, it is beautiful that Eva wants to maintain a place of deference and honor for her mother and to show that her mother is not forgotten. It would not surprise me if she was also feeling on some level like her dad was basically choosing to forget her mother at this point, and that could maybe make her feel like she needs to be the one to continue to hold a certain candle for her. But from Ashley's perspective, I can see her taking that replacement as a message from Eva saying, I have zero interest in having a relationship with you because there is this impenetrable barrier that will always stand in the way, and it is the memory of my mother. And while I can totally understand that instinct by Eva, if that is in fact how she's feeling, and perhaps that desire to hold on to all of that, I am not by any means vilifying Eva in any of this situation here. I can still see how that would be a tough situation for any stepmother to be working through. And then you've got one who is as young as Ashley is, who's been going through this whole whirlwind romance, and all of a sudden her whole life has changed in a matter of like days, let alone weeks and months, is actually not all that unreasonable to me that she would become unhinged over something like this. So then to bring this back to the point of the idea that this context is actually helping the defense here, I admit this has been a little bit of a long side quest. To me anyway, this goes back to Eva's testimony about Ashley having temper tantrums over little things. And where earlier I might have looked at that characterization and given it some weight, now I'm seeing Ashley in a much more empathetic and reasonable light here. And I'm thinking that Eva's characterization may have actually been off, and it may have been off because of her own perceptions and her own emotions in the moment. Now, another thing that the state really wanted to hammer Ashley on cross-examination on was the multiple injunctions that Ashley filed against Doug and the multiple reports of child abuse about Emerson. Remember that the state has characterized all of this as essentially Ashley doing everything that she can to just rip Emerson away from Doug because she's manipulative and evil. I will admit, looking at the succession of unsuccessful accusations that she made against Doug initially did look like there was a really good possibility that that's exactly what Ashley was doing here. But for me personally, this actually backfired. It all changed when O'Donnell cross-examined Ashley on these things, because all it did was give Ashley an opportunity to contextualize her reasoning for all of this. And it's odd because usually that happens on direct examination. And then on cross, we hear tidbits of things that are alarming that then have to be cleared up on redirect. But here what happened is in the inverse, which is not what you want if you are the state cross-examining the defendant. Anyway, as an example, as it relates to the injunctions against Doug, at first it seemed like she was just lying to get injunction after injunction after injunction, like just to separate him from his daughter. But what came out on her cross-examination was that the reason that she tried to file these injunctions in Florida was because the one in South Carolina was set to expire. And so this scared her. The last time she got an injunction, she got it because of the gun incident. And since she's had that injunction in place, she says that he's been stalking her and putting a tracker on her car and even admitting to doing that, by the way. But at least he hasn't been doing these overtly scary things like throwing a gun at her. So now that made sense to me as to why, in her mind, getting a new injunction in Florida was so important, so that she could at least maintain that overall status quo, even if it wasn't exactly ideal, because she says that she was still being stalked. And when that initially did not work out because Judge Moreland denied her injunction and put a time-sharing plan in place between her and Doug, it also made sense to me as to why Ashley would then decide to play a more active role in playing ball, so to speak, with Doug, rather than to keep him out and away from herself entirely. If she was afraid of him and she had seen what he would do to their pets out of anger, for example, there's nothing saying that he wouldn't do something similar to their very young child as well. So deciding to spend time with him while he was spending court-ordered time with Emerson kind of makes more sense to me if she's also feeling like a protective mother who would rather put herself in harm's way if it meant being in a better position to protect her daughter. I've got to say, I'm not exactly a mom just yet. Almost, but not yet. So I'm not fully there just yet, but being in my third trimester of pregnancy right now, I've seen enough changes in my own brain so far to understand that instinct at least. Now, another example of context that came up on Ashley's cross-examination related to the reports of Doug allegedly abusing Emerson. It did seem like a lot of reports initially, and it seemed like these were unsubstantiated. At least it seemed like that was the conclusions that were made by the authorities. And when that happens, that does seem to cut away from the person that's making those accusations. But there was at least one instance on cross-examination where O'Donnell tried to dig into this. And Ashley gave actually a pretty good response that made her seem much more reasonable on this point. You see, apparently one of these accusations was from a visit to Emerson's pediatrician for a checkup. O'Donnell tried to make it sound like the whole purpose of this checkup was to report abuse to the pediatrician so that the doctor, as a mandatory reporter, would report it. But what Ashley said was they were there for a checkup. And at the very end, as doctors do at the end of basically any appointment, her doctor asked her, "Do you have any other questions?" And so Ashley testified that she did in fact have some questions about some weird behavior that she saw that Emerson was exhibiting. And so she showed the doctor a video of Emerson. The doctor apparently reached a conclusion that Emerson was being abused and said that as a mandatory reporter, she was required to report it to the authorities. And then the doctor turned to her and said, "You too are a mandatory reporter, and if you don't report this, it's going to be seen as negligent." So basically, Ashley testified that she felt that she had to report it as well, and so she did. Again, the way that this ended up coming out made Ashley, to me anyway, look so much more reasonable, and I think this backfired on the state. But there's one more thing that I think completely backfired on the prosecution, and this was towards the end of Ashley's cross-examination. Specifically, I'm talking about the part of the cross-examination where O'Donnell not only had Ashley recount the shooting, but to completely reenact it. She started her questioning here by pointing out that Ashley wasn't so afraid of Doug that she felt that she couldn't be alone with him while moving. And I will say, I know that there are people who are pointing to this fact as proof that she wasn't actually afraid of Doug on that day, and that this means that she wasn't in fear of her life at the time of the shooting. But the thing about DV is, the victim isn't necessarily always in fear of the abuser all the time. There are cycles to abuse after all. And it could also be that maybe Ashley thought that given that moving is stressful, it's actually safer to have a 2-year-old out of the house while Doug is there so that there's one less thing to set him off. And as a reminder, for self-defense, the fear doesn't need to be there 24/7. In fact, it typically is triggered by a single event that causes the fear. That, paired with a DV background where someone has shown extreme volatility at the drop of a hat in the past, can be an absolutely adequate fact pattern for alleging self-defense. But anyway, here's where the cross-examination on the subject went.
You weren't so afraid that you wanted your mother to stay there and watch.
No, we were just packing to move.
Okay, so you weren't afraid.
I definitely didn't expect this to happen.
So it was okay with you that your mother left?
Yeah, at that time.
Okay. So if I heard you right during your direct, you said he bumped your shoulder twice. Body check, I don't know if that's what you called it. He walked into you with a box, right?
Yes.
And then at the end, you say he slapped you?
He hit me. I wouldn't know how to classify it. He struck me, he hit me.
Was his hand open or closed?
I don't remember.
Okay. And because of those things, you claim that you thought he was going to kill you.
He had never hit me before.
Okay. And you thought he was going to kill you.
He wouldn't let me leave. I tried to leave, he stopped me.
The question is, you thought he was going to kill you.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when you were in the bedroom, you decided to get your firearm. And it was where?
It was in a storage bin on top of the laundry basket.
Okay. So I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 52. If you could turn around and look at that. Where was your firearm?
It was in the bin on top of the basket.
Here?
That's the basket. The laundry
Where was
basket.
the bin?
It's that right on top.
Okay. So it was in here.
Yes, ma'am.
Why would you have a firearm in there?
I had just emptied all the furniture and everything out of my room, and it was kind of like what was left from my drawers, and so it got put into a bin.
Okay. And that was not your only firearm in that room, correct?
Correct.
You had a firearm in the closet.
My carry gun was in my backpack, which was my purse at the time.
So in this room, with a mattress and a broom and a hamper, you had 2 firearms.
Yes.
So you go into the room and you grab your firearm. Is it in a holster?
I don't remember.
Okay. And you claim that Doug does what?
He came and slammed the door open. He was standing in the doorway. He said, "You're fucking done."
He said, "You're fucking done." And that made you fear for your life.
Yeah.
Can we turn the lights up, please? Thank you. So he says you're fucking done, and you point the gun and you shoot.
I held it out in front of me first so he could see it. And I said, "Stop."
Judge, if I could have her step down so she can demonstrate.
You may.
If you could just come down. So Doug opens the door and does what?
Standing in the doorway, kind of like this. And he said, "You're fucking done." And I held the gun out in front of me and I said, "Stop." We got into this like fighting pose, literally turned sideways. And he was like moving around with his like arms in his hands. And he started like inching forward towards me.
So he why do you call it a fighting stance?
He was like a fighter. I don't know, like a ninja or something, I don't know.
Okay, so he's standing there, he turns to like this and starts moving his arms around.
Oh my God.
Well, show me, what was he doing?
Kind of like, I don't know, he got like this, and he was like making like fighting motions. I don't know, I'm not a fighter, I don't know.
Okay.
It was scary.
Did he have his hands in fists?
Not at that point, they were like, I don't know.
Was he coming at you like this?
When he lunged at me, he came really quickly.
Okay, so he lunged. Was his fist up when he
I
lunged?
don't remember.
Okay. So you start shooting, and he does what?
He kept coming at me.
Okay, so then you keep shooting again. And he falls down on his back.
His legs went up in the air.
Okay, where do his legs go?
In the air.
How high in the air?
I don't know.
Did they go over his head?
I don't know. It's like his feet slipped out.
Okay.
And his feet and his legs went up in the air.
And were you still shooting at the time?
I don't remember.
You can have a seat. So after this incident, you claim that you had swelling to your face, right?
It's going to take a minute. All right, there's the jury. Please close up your notes. Put them.
So, this was all designed by the state to get Ashley to reveal inconsistencies in her recounting of how the shooting happened and to reveal that her version of events is somehow nonsensical. But when I watched this, I had several takeaways. Number one, this demonstrates to me personally that Ashley absolutely was in fear of her life at the moment that she shot him. As she's recounting everything, especially when she's made to reenact it, to me, this looks 100% like someone who is in the moment reliving the trauma. No one is going to convince me that she's acting here. The way that her emotions appeared, the timing of the emotional upset, and the way that it overcame her and then lingered afterwards, all of that to me suggested a real emotion, which, by the way, matched perfectly with the way that she displayed it during her direct examination, talking about the same subject. No one can time emotions that perfectly, unless they're some very seasoned actor with some insane acting skills. So her being in fear in the moment and given the relationship history, the corroborated events of him using a gun to threaten her with physical violence in the past, I see self-defense here. Number two, her precision on the things that happened in the moment is lacking. In fact, it's very, very fuzzy. And some are going to look at that and say, see, she's making it all up. But I say this tells me the opposite. Memory can be a very fragile thing, and it is also very, very malleable. And when someone is recounting a traumatic memory, the details tend to get even more convoluted. So ironically, although in trials, we're always looking for inconsistencies as a thing to avoid, when it comes to trauma memory, the truth is that the best evidence that it was in fact traumatic is the fact that it's incredibly fuzzy. Compare this to Amber Heard, for example, who claimed that Johnny Depp hit her so hard that she was knocked to the floor, and then she recounted details of the carpet right next to her face. There's also the fact that Amber Heard's stories got more and more detail-oriented over time as she was continuing to relay these allegations. All of this was antithetical to these being actually accurate representations of what really happened. And this leads me to my final takeaway from this whole shooting reenactment. Where the state wanted to unmask Ashley Benefield as an Amber Heard, I think this completely backfired. Because when I watched this, I did not see Amber Heard. And if you watched Depp v. Heard with me on this channel live streamed and in recaps, you know that I had some very strong feelings about that case as it progressed, and that I continue to have strong feelings about Miss Heard moving forward. But here, I do not see Amber Heard. I see Gabby Petito if Gabby Petito had survived because she had had a firearm on her. If you're not familiar with Gabby Petito, she was a young woman who was murdered by her boyfriend, Brian Laundrie, while they were on a road trip across the United States in a van. She was trying to make it as a van life influencer, and on the way, somewhere in Utah, they got pulled over and questioned for erratic driving. There was body cam footage of the questioning, and this was played like all over the place when it was uncovered. Anyway, after questioning both Gabby and Brian, the police amazingly determined that Gabby had been the perpetrator of domestic abuse against Brian. So they separated them for a night, putting Brian up in a hotel so that they could cool off. The next day, the two traveled on, and just weeks later, Gabby went missing, and Brian was suddenly driving back from Wyoming to Florida on his own. Not long after that, Gabby's remains were found in a Wyoming campground, and eventually Brian took his own life in the Florida Everglades, but not before admitting to murdering her in his journal. Anyway, watching Ashley Benefield's cross-examination here, it just reminded me so much of Gabby Petito, and particularly the body cam footage that emerged, capturing her and Brian just weeks before her murder.
I've been really stressed, and he doesn't really believe that I could do any of it. So that's kind of been like I don't know, he's like down there. I don't know, we've been fighting all morning, and he wouldn't let me in the car before. And then
Why wouldn't he let you in the car? Because of your OCD?
He told me I needed to calm down. Yeah. But I'm perfectly calm. I'm calm all the time. And he really stresses me out. And this is a rough morning.
This was Gabby recounting a fight that she had had with Brian, which escalated to him grabbing her face and then her hitting him in the car that day in Utah. Obviously, these are relatively minor injuries between hitting and grabbing someone's face, especially in comparison to other injuries that have happened in other DV cases and also what ended up happening in Gabby Petito's case. But this has me thinking that if she had survived that encounter in Wyoming and were asked to recount that event in an adversarial context like a trial, she probably would sound just like Ashley Benefield. Now, my opinion on all of this is just my opinion, of course. Ultimately, what matters is what the jury sees. And as I've emphasized before, there is no way of knowing what they're thinking as this trial progresses. If they don't know all that much about DV, there's a lot that they might miss here if the defense is not allowed to have their DV expert testify particularly. And they may or may not know about Gabby Petito, and they may or may not have seen that same body cam footage that I referenced here. I don't know, and you might actually be thinking very differently about all of this. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Anyway, let's finally move on to the next witness who testified. The next witness was Samara Sweet, although the jury did not see her testify because she was there just for a proffer. Basically, the defense wanted her to be able to testify, and so they had this proffer to determine if she'd have any testimony that would actually be admissible. As it turns out, she is another attorney, and she's the attorney who at the time of all of this was working for the state attorney's office. More specifically, she worked on Ashley's DV case after the sheriff's office referred it over. And basically, she testified that she investigated Ashley's claim about the package that Doug sent in violation of the South Carolina restraining order. And as a result of her investigation, she believed that Ashley had a valid claim. The only reason that she did not file this claim and move forward with the litigation was because she was waiting on a receipt showing that Doug had sent the package. Unfortunately for Ashley, though, by the time this receipt was received by Miss Sweet's office, Miss Sweet had actually taken up a new job elsewhere. So it seems that ultimately what happened was Ashley's case probably ended up getting lost through the cracks of bureaucracy when it got shifted to someone else's docket. But now, in the end, the judge determined that Miss Sweet was not going to be able to testify to any of this. And the reason for that is because most of her testimony was going to be improper opinion testimony about whether or not she believed Ashley had a DV case worth pursuing. Now, under normal circumstances, that would probably be the correct decision. However, during Ashley's cross-examination, the state also asked a bunch of questions that essentially amounted to, Judge Moreland didn't believe you, the police didn't believe you, and no one believed you about your DV claims, right? And these are generally impermissible questions, in part because they are more prejudicial than probative, and they're also speculative. But although Taylor objected to some of them, there was still some testimony that came in on this. And so an argument could have been made by Taylor with regard to Miss Sweet's testimony here that the state opened the door to this kind of opinion testimony because O'Donnell asked all over the place about no one in the system actually believing Ashley. While, meanwhile, here is an attorney with the state attorney's office who, in fact, did believe her. The judge may have still denied it even with this argument, but I still think it's a good argument that could have at least been made. Okay, so next we had Amy Carlton, and her testimony actually was in front of the jury, although it was super brief. Basically, she just testified that on September 27th, 2020, she and her husband were out walking their dog in the evening. Then, all of a sudden, they heard some gunshots from inside one of the houses. About 30 seconds later, they saw a woman running out of the house, screaming and heading for the neighbor's front door, where she started to bang on the front door. And to top it off, she described the woman as hysterical as she was doing all this. Now with this witness, there was no cross-examination, so after like 5 or 10 minutes on the stand, she was free to go. After this, the jury was released for the day because the rest of the time in court was dedicated to a Daubert hearing. If you're not familiar, a Daubert hearing is something that happens when one side proposes to admit an expert witness and the other side wants to be able to ask a bunch of questions of that witness before the court permits them to testify as an expert. The whole purpose here is to see if this person is actually qualified to testify as an expert, to see if the scope of their expertise qualifies them to testify about what they're being asked to testify on, and to evaluate the overall admissibility of the proposed testimony. And so here, Mr. Ferris is being proposed as an expert on battered spouse syndrome, or at the very least, domestic violence. I will say that for the defense, his testimony would be crucial to explain a lot of Ashley's behavior, which seems to fit squarely within DV victim behavior. To illustrate this, Mr. Ferris used what's known as the Duluth power and control wheel. He went through every portion of it and explained how this all relates to DV and how it relates to different kinds of behaviors by both abusers and victims. Overall, I found his testimony during this hearing to be very well informed and educational, and I think that this could go a long way to really help the jury understand Ashley's various behaviors much better under DV context. But it is unclear if the judge is going to allow his testimony to come in, because there was a question about how this is going to be able to be used as the battered spouse syndrome, if he's an expert on battered spouse syndrome as opposed to just DV generally, in other matters like that. So we'll see. Personally, like I said, this testimony would be incredibly helpful for the jury, so I really do hope that the judge allows it in. But overall, I think that day 4 was a very impactful day. I know that there are plenty of people out there who don't see Ashley's testimony the same way that I do, and that's totally understandable. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion and perspective, and so in a case like this, people are bound to see some different conclusions. These are just my impressions and the way that everything resonated with me, but those are my thoughts. What do you think? Do you think that Ashley is a genuine survivor of DV? Do you think this was self-defense? Or do you think that she murdered Doug? Also, what did you think of the prosecutor's cross-examination here? And if you think I'm wrong at any point during this video, give me the details. Tell me where I'm wrong. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more daily recaps of this trial or more coverage of crazy cases and interesting legal topics, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out. And if you're really loving the content and you want to know how to best support the channel and get perks like early access to non-trial recap videos, consider becoming a member of Fight Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Links to both are in the description below. Otherwise, I'll see you on day 5.